Should we get started?
Yeah. I mean, do you want to catch up a little bit?
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, ready to chat. I mean, the links are out, so
Awesome.
um, yeah.
Yes, let's do it.
Well, the moon is in Capricorn, and
Early, early cap.
yeah, I'm tired. I'm
I
feeling
feel you.
great.
This Mercury situation right now is
Um,
it's just like killing me. Like, I've got one more assignment and then I'm done for the weekend. But it's a writing project.
mm,
And I feel like I'm just not making any progress and my thoughts aren't cohesive. And normally I love writing, but I'm hating it lately.
yeah, I think I just can't wait for next week when everything starts just getting into Aries and kicking everything into gear because this watery mess is just not it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was always saying to some other people, like everything just feels so balsamic right now. Like the sun being almost in Aries, like at the very end, of the winter, and now the moon's waning off too. It's like we're just getting ready for this huge new moon, zero Aries next week, and like I just want it to happen already.
I feel you. I definitely feel you. I'm ready for my perfections to change over.
Mm.
I'm so looking forward to get out of the eighth house. Um, yeah, so definitely I relate to that. Like just trying to keep my eyes on the upcoming Aries season.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting there. Only a few more days.
Hmm.
But yeah. Aries
Yeah.
season's going to be interesting, though. I mean, there's just so much going on because we're kind of heading into eclipses and Mars in Cancer and just a lot. So,
Yeah, honestly, I never thought I'd say this, but I cannot wait for Mars and Cancer just because I need Mars to get the hell out of Gemini. Like,
I am nervous. I definitely want him out of Gemini, but I just want him in Leo already. Like I want it to be like May and June, and uh, we'll get there.
yeah, we will. Fingers crossed. I'm definitely gonna get pinched by a crab while Mars is in Cancer. It's gotta happen. I tweet, it's on my bucket list. So is
You said you
being,
want it to happen then.
yes.
Why?
Why wouldn't I want that experience? Okay, so the same thing happens with snakes. When I was like an angsty little high schooler, I used to go into pet stores and be like, "Can I hold your meanest snake?" Because it was on my bucket list to get bit by a snake, and they never bit me. I still had never been bit by a snake. And the workers would be like, "He's definitely gonna bite you. He bites us every time we try to feed him." And I never got bit. So something about me being like, I want you to bite me. I want you to pinch me. Keeps the animal from doing it. But it has to happen. It
Well,
has
make
to.
it angry enough and it will. So,
Right.
well,
Yeah.
um, all right. You want to get started?
I am ready.
Okay.
Um, Hello, Mercuranians listening
Yes.
today.
Um, Also just had to say Jared said hello,
Hi,
but
Jared.
Jared's got like some back-to-back calls, so he's gonna have to watch it back. But he popped in to say hi. So hey Jared. And everyone else that's on here, hello.
Hello,
Um,
hello.
oh, Jared just said pinched by a crowd while Mars is in Cancer seems like great remediation. Like forcing it to manifest like that so it doesn't come up in some other worse way.
Great idea.
Yeah. Well, that is not my preferred method of remediation, but have your way as you will. Yeah, I mean, let's dive into it though. So we finished off at the end of 14 after, sorry, at the end of 15 last week after talking a lot about all the many kinds of aspects. And yeah, I think we also now we found a chart that we like and that demonstrates a lot of the things that we'll talk about today and even in past and future episodes. So hopefully we're going to be kind of using this chart and guiding that through a lot of the examples and principles, which we will today. And yeah, just wanted to say that because I think we'll bring the chart out and again put this into context. And that will be kind of what we stick with. And we'll have other ones, but this might be like kind of our example one, so to say.
Yeah, and like the way that this is teaching you step by step how to delineate a nativity, we're just going to bring that nativity forward and go through the steps with it. Of
Mhm.
course, as you mentioned, like we'll have other charts involved, but this is going to be our primary nativity.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Alrighty. Well, today we're going to be talking about um, certain like zodiacal configurations and kind of how they relate to aspects, pretty much.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, that will, and I don't think it'll be a super long episode, but there's definitely some important like terms and definitions in here that will be like pretty important as we kind of keep talking about aspects and things like later on as we get into the later 20s and 30s when there's a lot more on just aspectual configurations and aspect dynamics and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we'll cover this more a little bit later, but a lot of the definitions are very similar. They kind of refer to the same concept, even though they have like a different language or something like that. So I feel like that's just kind of bracing us for him to use those words interchangeably or without a definition in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, should we get started?
Yeah, I'm
Chapter
ready.
16. All right.
I think it's your turn to go first.
Yeah. So we're at chapter 16. And also, this copy of Rhetorius the Egyptian is published by the American Federation for Astrologers. You can purchase it online through their website or on Amazon or in person at their location in Flagstaff, Arizona, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, they are supporting us to do this project, and we love them for that. And you can get your copy to follow along with us, or there is a partially available version of the book on Google Books already, and you can read along some of it there too. So,
Definitely. Yeah. And there are a couple of other translators who have put work out of this out,
mhm.
but we are using the AFA's version with Holden's translation today.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. So, chapter 16, disjunct signs and those having sympathy with each other. Signs that are disjunct but having sympathy with each other are the equal rising signs and those having equal power and those of like zone. For example, equal rising are Aries and Pisces, Gemini and Capricorn, Cancer and Sagittarius, Virgo and Libra, and of equal power are Gemini and Cancer, Virgo and Aries, Libra and Pisces, Sagittarius and Capricorn. Of like zone are Taurus with Libra, Aries with Scorpio, and most of the other disjunct signs they established as being wholly ineffective as regards sympathy. This chapter is combined with the joint risings of the signs and the joint ascensions of the stars, and with the friendships and sympathies of men and women, and parents and brothers, and friends and slaves. So I think actually I'm just going to start off by sharing some diagrams that we have to show about what this chapter is talking all about. While I look for that, do you want to start just chatting about it still?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that really kind of struck me about this is that the signs that are equal rising kind of takes primacy here. Like he talks about that first. He introduces that idea first, which I
Mm,
think is really fascinating. That visual phenomena of the signs coming up above the ascendant at that same pace, something super, super crucial. And
mm,
those having equal power, that refers to antiscia, where the power is the amount of daylight, or sorry, conversely, it's the amount of daylight.
mm,
Yeah, with day and night. And then those of like zone, this was the only one that I couldn't really put my finger on that because It could mean a number of different things. What did you think about of like zone?
Well, like zone or homozone, as like the Greek word is, refers to the signs that are ruled by the same planet. So,
Mm,
there are sympathies with signs that aren't in aspect. Like, for instance, he says Taurus and Libra, which are both ruled by Venus, but
right.
by their aspect in the zodiac, they don't have a configuration. So, same
Hmm.
thing with Aries and Scorpio, which he mentions. Although he didn't mention Capricorn and Aquarius, which is another aversion sign pair on
Right.
the same planet. But I also, they're a homozone to me, as far as I see that and use that. Like, if, for instance, Saturn's in Aquarius and he's ruling some planets in Capricorn, yeah, he can't see them, but like they're all in his domain. So there's a little bit of work going on there that he can kind of help them out with. Same thing if you have like a Libra Venus and a moon in Taurus, or the sun in Taurus with Venus, or maybe whatever, Saturn and Taurus, say, and Libra Venus. There's some sympathy because even though they're not related by an aspect, they can connect based off of the homozone relationship.
Yeah. So you're right. I always forget that that's what like zone refers to. Aren't there other terms for that? I feel like
Yeah, like agreeing in the journey, agreeing in the
hmm.
belt, are other like more medieval terms, I think. And like in girding, I believe is another
Mm.
term that is used for that. Yeah, I think that's most of them though.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one as well because it's just even though there's no sight, there's sympathy,
Mm,
right? Like they might not be able to truly see each other in the way that the rest of the zodiac can, like particular
mm,
with like Aries, Scorpio, and like Taurus, Libra, you know. I guess like Saturn's signs might be a little bit different because they are like back to back. It kind
mm,
of there's almost this same feel of like bodily conjunction across signs, you
mm,
know, that same kind of principle that like okay, like the boundaries are blurred a little bit here.
right.
um but when it comes to like zone where the signs don't see each other and they're not bordering each other,
Mm,
that's it's really fascinating because without sight, I don't know, it still has connection.
yeah. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And I know Rob Hand has a really cool lecture on YouTube where he explains this and um, yeah, it just shows how you can use it, especially along the lines of like house interpretation, which I think is a really valuable way that that technique could be added into your chart analysis. But if anything, to your just general knowledge and analysis of like the 12 different ascendants, because every ascendant has an archetypal structure in the chart based off of the homozone signs that are each in charge of and linking like two different houses topics. Um, and in volume 2 of Ancient Astrology, Dimitri George also has a chapter on this where you can kind of look at all 12 and see what those connections are. Um, so yeah, I think the homozone, they offer a lot of important just ways to think about how things are connected when you don't normally see it.
I like the word homozone more than like zone.
Yeah, I always say homozone.
Yeah,
People
I
should
like
use
that a
that.
lot more. Hmm.
So I have the diagrams now if we want to talk about the equal power and equal rising signs.
Okay.
Um, so I'll start with equal power. And I'd say just to start off with anything that we did 2 episodes again on these concepts of antiscia and contra-antiscia, and that these are, if you're not familiar with that, he's not saying those words explicitly here because he's just describing like the nature of what the sympathy really is, which is about the equal power or the equal light that we get with this first configuration here, which is the antiscia relationship. So we see that on the solstitial axis here, we reflect the sign pairs, and that we're going to find essentially times with the same amount of daylight and hours of night. And it doesn't necessarily mean summer solstice or winter on either end because it will be different based on the hemisphere. But for instance, the sun at 15 Gemini is exactly reflecting when the sun is at 15 Cancer. And that on those 2 days on the calendar, no matter northern or southern hemisphere, you'll have the same amount of hours of daylight and the same hours of nighttime. Yeah. And so it's the same for all the rest of these pairs. So like he's mentioned, he didn't actually mention Taurus, Leo, Aqua, and Scorpio because they are already in the square. So they're not a disjunct pair that's getting a sympathy. So just noting that he only mentioned the four that are disjunct, but the whole concept is relating to these equal light reflections.
Right. And those squares are that fit across those light reflections are sympathetic.
Mhm.
They're not as they're not as tense as like a traditional square without that sympathy there.
Mhm. Yeah, it is interesting to note though, because essentially all the fixed squares become sympathetic. Um,
Mhm.
because as we'll see in the next diagram, which just reflects the other way, all the fixed signs are like kind of connected to each other. But for instance, a mutable square, like Gemini and Pisces, there's not necessarily any sympathy because they're not ruled by the same planet. They're not of the same trigon or element. They don't have the same amount of hours of daylight. They're not equal rising. Um, so I guess we can now just go on to show the next one, which is about equal rising. All right. Can you see this diagram now?
Mhm.
All right. Do you want to talk a little bit about contra-antiscia?
Yeah. So contra-antiscia basically takes the ascensional times of the signs and we're evaluating their sympathies based on that principle. How quickly do they rise above the ascendant at a given location? So you see those pairs, Aries and Pisces. If you're in the northern hemisphere, they rise the quickest, and then all the way down through to Virgo and Libra, which will rise the slowest.
Mhm.
And just specifically in the northern hemisphere. And so the signs from Aries to Virgo are said to be commanding signs because they have more daylight. And so, with this principle of contra-antiscia, there's a little bit more of a power imbalance than there is with just antiscia, because the signs on the left of this diagram have more daylight and therefore more power to command the signs on the right. So a planet in Taurus commands a planet in Aquarius.
Mhm. Yeah, and we'll get to that more in depth too when we read the chapter on commanding and obeying. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's the essence here is that we have these signs that are rising in equal ascension is this sympathy that this relation gives us because we are connecting now signs of the sort of reciprocal amount of daylight where, for instance, in Cancer season, days are the longest, nights are the shortest. And in Sag here, opposite to that, the nights are the longest and the days are the shortest. So they have a sort of reciprocal relationship. And also the symbols in the middle here on the last two diagrams I showed are sort of just a little glyph I've made to kind of show this where with contra-antiscia or the equal ascension, like we have this kind of reversed, like reciprocal relationship between the daylight hours involved with them. Um, and yeah, it just kind of is nice to see how like they're equal rising. So their ascensional time will be the same because it's around this equinoctial axis where it like increases to like a maximum and then begins to decrease again. So like that way back down is just going to reflect the way up. So yeah, again, he doesn't mention the Taurus Aqua or the Leo Scorpio because they already are square. But yeah, we have these four other sign pairs, which normally, Cap Gemini, Cancer Sagittarius, right? They're sort of exotic combinations, but they share this awesome sympathy that lets them like really have a connection to each other. Yeah.
Nice. Did you want to move on to Dodekatemoria?
Um, yeah. Or do you want to read chapter 17?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, duh. So chapter 17. Chapter 17, squares that are sympathetic and those that are not. Now the signs having sympathy with each other by square aspect are these: Taurus with Aquarius and Leo with Scorpio because of equal rising. Again, Leo with Taurus and Scorpio with Aquarius because of equal power, and Gemini with Virgo and Sagittarius with Pisces because of like zone. But All of the other squares are ineffective in sympathy. Every square aspect was established through 90 degrees, and every sextile aspect through 60. For 4 times 90 is 360, 6 times 60 is 360, but the opposition through 180 degrees for twice makes 360, which number of degrees the whole circle has. So it's really interesting because he starts by talking about like squares that are sympathetic and those that aren't. So squares through like zone, so a square between like Gemini and Virgo is going to be much friendlier than a square between Cancer and Libra, right? But it's really interesting because that section kind of, I don't know, spirals into just kind of laying out aspect degrees in general
Mm.
and like how those work and like how it totals up to 360. So, yeah, I don't know, kind of an interesting little section. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Should we throw up just maybe one more time, just to show what we were looking at again? Like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
wait, which one is it? Oh, this one. Um, yeah, so those leg zones, we can see where like Jupiter's domicile is square and Mercury's domicile is square. So that square can be sympathetic. But then we also know that because of the reflection along the solstices, like Taurus and Leo are going to share, Aqua Scorpio will share, and then reflection on the equinoxes, the Taurus Aqua and Leo Scorpio, like he says. So yeah, sympathetic squares.
Yeah, something really interesting about the like squares on the fixed axis, and we don't have to go like super far into this,
Mhm.
but I think it's interesting how like, I don't know, the sun and Venus, like, all right, there isn't like a super explicit archetypal situation with that in terms of dignity, you know? But with like Mars and Saturn, like there very clearly is. With Libra and Saturn, there very clearly is a dignity situation happening there, you know? Like, because Venus's sign of Libra is where Saturn is exalted, right? Mars exalts in Saturn's sign of Capricorn, and then the sun exalts in Mars's sign of Aries. But then the sun and Venus like don't have this same kind of connection that is happening across like all of the other planets in those sympathetic squares,
Mhm.
or at least in the like anticial squares.
Yeah, it is interesting because the all the other ones definitely have some kind of reception or connection in like their joint rulership of
Mm-hmm.
signs. But yeah, Sun and Venus are, if anything, like you said, yeah, Venus, I mean, she makes the sun fall in Libra.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting to see how Taurus and Leo kind of come together to share a nicer aspect of that square. And I do think that square is very sympathetic, like, and we talked all about these kind of pairs and how they play out archetypally and what they kind of represent in those episodes. So definitely check that out if you haven't. But yeah, Taurus Leo is a really beautiful way that like it to me it almost, I mean, it feels like a sex. I mean, if you have a nasty malefic involved with your sect light, right? I mean, some things can't be completely mitigated, but they're more on equal ground, right? Is just really the idea than compared to
Mm-hmm.
Aries and Cancer, which are like very different in my
Right. Yeah, yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah, definitely. There's a very striking difference between Aries and Cancer and Taurus and Leo.
Yeah.
Hmm.
All right, cool. Are we good to go on?
Yeah.
Let me check the chat and see if anyone's saying anything. Yeah, no. All right, cool. Well, chapter 18. So the Dodekatemories of the stars. The ancients set forth the Dodekatemories of the stars in 3 ways. Paul, in his introduction, said to multiply the degrees of a star by 13 and then cast the result from the beginning of the sign itself, giving 30 degrees to each sign. And wherever the number comes to, in that sign is the Dodekatemorian of the star. But Dorothea says in the 11th book to multiply the degrees by 12. And Ptolemy says in the 26th chapter of his first book to cast the degrees by 2.5 per sign. And then he's going to go on to show which method that he prefers. But before I get into that, because it's going to kind of get a little math heavy, he's actually going to explain this too, but I just want to say the last two ways he just mentioned actually give the same result. Dorotheus and Ptolemy are actually doing the same thing in two different ways. Paul's method, though, is a little bit different. So the whole concept here with Dodekatemoria literally just means like a 12th part or a 12th portion, is that in each zodiac sign, we can imagine splitting it up into 12 equal portions that contain a whole zodiac within that whole sign. So I'm going to find a diagram. I have it somewhere. But essentially the idea is that, yeah, so we can, your planet is going to be at some degree within a sign and say it's in Leo, but based off of its like 12th part or this minor subdivision, it might actually land and put its influence into a whole other place in the zodiac. And so there's, like he's saying here, two different ways we can measure where this like reprojected degree lands. And the only discrepancy is really that Paulus's method of doing it is actually doing it by a multiplication by 13, which is technically a different harmonic than the 12th harmonic, which is fitting 12 equal portions into a sign. Paul is actually fitting in 13 equal portions. And the reason that's kind of nice is that if you count through a sign, and I'm sorry, I'm just trying to look for this diagram here. If you count through a sign, it's like eventually when you start at the first one, so say the first degrees of Aries are ruled by Aries, you're going to get through to Taurus, Gemini, all the way out to Pisces. But then when you're at 29 Aries, you're in the 12th part of Pisces, you move next to 0 Taurus. But you kind of make that jump because you go from Pisces then to Taurus. And so then you go through Taurus and you'll go Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, all the way to Aries in the last degree of Taurus. And then you'll move from Aries, the 12th part in Aries, to Gemini. So there's kind of this weird jump that you have to do when you keep the 12 parts. But what Paul does is by adding a 13th part, it allows for like a full continuation, that there's no jump. There's no like kind of discrepancy. It's continuous. It's just that the math is a little bit different, and they're not like even as nicely as the 12 parts are like 2.5 equal degrees in degree portions.
So does he add the same sign to the end, like just how the first degrees of a sign are this, like the actual sign? It's like the first 2.5 degrees of Cancer are Cancer. By dividing it by 13, is he adding 2.5 degrees of Cancer to the end so that you don't have to jump from Gemini into Leo?
Almost, just barely, not quite, because it won't unfortunately be the 2.5 degrees, because that will be if you're dividing by 12. So when you divide by 13, they become like just a slightly less than that value. So if, for instance, these are the normal 12th parts. So if I zoom in on Capricorn here, you can see how there are exactly 2 full degrees and a half degree, and then 1 more half degree and 2 full degrees. So the first 5 degrees of Capricorn cover 2 signs. And with what Paul would do is it would go Cap, Aqua, Pisces, all the way through to Sag, and then
Cap again.
And then you could go to Aquarius. But it's it's 13. So the math isn't as pretty. The only way around that is essentially, and so what he's explaining here that you can do is you can either measure it like this. This is how Ptolemy does it. You are looking at the 2.5 degree slivers within a sign and you see where it falls in. Or the way that Dorotheus does it, that what you can actually do is take its degree just within the sign, say it's at 12 degrees. Because we're just essentially simulating that it's moving through the signs like it normally would, you can just take its degree and multiply it by 12. And then that will actually project it into Gemini. So if you take 13, this will go, call it 14 Capricorn, you multiply 14 by 12, it'll be, a little over like 160 degrees or whatever, which is almost 180. which would be Cancer. So, because then you're at 15 by 12, and you kind of reproject it, and that adds to, 180, and it moves around. So there's just two different ways. You can divide it up and look where it's landing, or you can just take the degree and multiply it by 12, and that gives you the total degrees, which you then just add around to see where that lands later on. And that's really the essence of the chapter. I don't even know if I need to read it because he's just giving some math, and that's really the gist of it, is what I just said. So yeah, I don't know if we really need to do that. I mean, if people are curious, like I could work out an example, but
skip it.
Yeah, because really, I'll just say, like, you can go onto astro.com and it will calculate this chart for you. You can go onto AstroSeek into the traditional calculator, and it will display these 12-part placements for you. But just know that it will be the 12th harmonic. The 13th harmonic is really its own separate thing. But yeah, they're both really ancient. They go way back to the Babylonians, like even more ancient than like the Egyptians. They were calculating these 12 parts of the zodiac like a long time ago, so thousands and thousands of years ago. So pretty cool stuff. But yeah, I mean, he'll go on later when we talk more about like how to interpret it. But the idea is just that, like, there's really two things. It's like if you have your sun in the Cancer Aries, like 12th part, so in Cancer, but it's 12th part is Aries, then it will be like, you're Cancer, but also kind of have some Aries traits too, in an sub influence. But also, like, imagine that your sun is in that house in Aries in your chart. So if you're a Cancer rising with the sun in Cancer in the first house, then your sun also will be participating in like an exalted way in your 10th house, right? And that really changes the dynamic of how your solar expression is, and just the other things your sun is doing in your chart. So for instance, the sun ruling like Leo in the second house for money, if its 12th part becomes exalted and moves into the 10th house, like that could improve your finances a lot, for instance. No, you're good. Oh yeah. Luminal Genie just said, I wonder what importance they have in a natal reading. Yeah, that was the essence right there. But we'll talk about it a lot more later on because it gets very nuanced. But I also did a talk about them for KazemiCon, which you can look up if you look up Journeying into the Dodekatemoria, KazemiCon, or you look up my name, Cameron Cassidy, and that you can find it. And I go explain a lot about how you can use them in a natal reading.
Yeah, the subdivisions of the zodiac are really helpful for like timing techniques as well. And I mean, like, Rhetorius doesn't really talk about this, but even the ninth parts are significant in medieval Islamic astrology. So yeah, definitely something worth checking out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love him. I swear by him. Did he say, I will read the last sentence of this chapter because he says something very valuable. He says, and the method of Dodekatemories is a necessity in nativities. And I also put down the astrological significations of these so that some might use them not just as in a secondary work. So he's saying you have to do them, and I'm putting them down so that you're not just going to do them in a secondary way or like a thing you can add on. It's like, no, you need these. And even Firmicus says when he talks about them, like some astrologers swear by the entire essence of a chart is revealed in the Dodekatemoria. And I completely agree. And yeah, he'll talk more about this. So yeah.
Cool. Alrighty. Are we ready to move on?
Yes, let's go.
All right. So chapter 19, the hearing and seeing signs. The hearing and seeing signs are also useful in flights and dangers and reports together with messages of the moon toward the star of Mercury, or the benefics by the way of moving at the first of the inquiries into this part. And the signs that see each other are these: Gemini sees Leo, and Leo sees Gemini. Similarly, too, Scorpio sees Virgo, and Virgo Scorpio, and so on accordingly. So, excuse me. So, there's a footnote here that says that here Rhetorius confuses the seeing signs Gemini and Leo, and the commanding and obeying or hearing signs Virgo and Scorpio, rather like Vettius Valens' anthology. So those that he mentions are the original pairings of the Alexandrian founders that are given by Manilius, Astronomica, and Paul of Alexandria in Introduction, chapters 8 and 9. They were supposed to be signs that had equal rising times or complementary rising times. So, as we mentioned before, signs that are complementary by ascension are contra-antiscia. And so I feel like this is a really interesting kind of tidbit because Manilius, he reflected off of the 15 degrees of cardinal, he reflected off the 15 degrees cardinal axis. So like 0 degrees of Aries was Antiscia with 29 degrees of Aries or contra-antiscia, right? So that continued outward. So then we have Pisces, and I'm sorry, I'm flipping this around. We'll start with Cancer because then that gives us the same examples that he's using here.
Do you want me to
So,
share the domiciles again? Like that chart?
sure.
Okay.
So, yeah. So when Manilius wrote this, wrote about this. He was reflecting off of 15 degrees cardinal axes. So through Cancer, 0 degrees Cancer would be Antiscia with 29 Cancer. And
Mm-hmm.
then we get that situation that he goes on to with Gemini sees Leo and Leo sees Gemini, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there, that makes sense. But then he switches and starts talking about contra-antiscia when he's referring to Scorpio and Virgo,
Mm-hmm.
because if you continued reflecting off of the Cancer point, it would go Leo Gemini, Taurus Virgo, Aries Libra, and Aries and Libra would just be an opposition, right? And then Pisces, Scorpio, so on and so forth. But what he's doing here is there's some kind of conflation between Antiscia and contra-antiscia when he's talking about the hearing and seeing signs.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if it's totally right that he confuses the seeing signs for the hearing signs. Sure, he conflates them together,
Mm-hmm.
but Manilius also uses seeing in reference to reflecting off of the Cancer solstitial axis.
Yeah.
And that was precessed by Firmicus to 0 degrees cardinal axes later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's just tricky because like we've had different authors like use these terms describing different things. So there's just like not a lot of clarity or consensus to begin with. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, I think it's important that like, he still introduces the equal power and equal rising sympathies and sign pairs still reflect off of the zero, the cardinal axis. Like that was chapter, we just read it, whatever it was, 16. And then now he's kind of introducing this other sympathy, which isn't inherently about connecting signs that are disjunct as much as it's just showing that there's like this apparent like seeing and hearing thing happening, which again, like other authors did use in terms of the Antiscia sign pairs. And again, it's like there's kind of just like not super clear consensus about this because they've called the seeing and hearing like exactly this here, these essentially the pairs that reflect off the 15 cardinal, like you said. But also like there's been like seeing and perceiving, like as we talk about it, and as is talked about in the tradition, like for Antiscia signs. So like for instance, Gemini kind of sees Cancer, and Cancer like perceives Gemini or like beholds it or like is perceived by it and like kind of sees it back. And Taurus like sees Leo and Aries sees Virgo and the other ones that kind of perceive the other one. So like we've talked about it like that in our episode that we did on it. Because we're kind of just looking, we weren't talking about this kind of 15 degree, not nonsense, but like it's kind of like a whole other thing that's like
So,
confusing with it.
yeah. So on Skyscript, Deborah Holding,
Mhm.
she listed that like there is some ambiguity here, and that principle of reflecting on the 15-degree cardinal point, like very well could be just a different technique, a different principle.
Mm.
But that was a note from 2020. And the original article was written sometime before 2015. I forget the year.
Mm,
But it hasn't been updated.
mm,
So I don't know. There wasn't really any clarity as to like
mm.
exactly what difference there is in technique. Yeah, or what's totally going on there. But I feel like the principle withstands, like conceptually it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's just important that we're realizing that like ultimately when he talks about seeing and hearing, we're still looking at like reflections that are kind of across from the signs of short ascension or Capricorn to Gemini that are kind of roughly looking down at the signs of long ascension that are like perceiving them or hearing them versus the oh, he actually doesn't explicitly talk about commanding and obeying. But when this is brought up, at least by other authors, normally then they say, oh, well, okay, look at the 15 Aries Libra, and we'll leave that opposition out of it. But then when we reflect out from the middle of there, we get Taurus and Pisces. And that, again, like you mentioned earlier, that these northern signs with like more light in the northern hemisphere will like command the other reflecting sign that is going to like obey it. And again, we can look at that as like the contra-antiscia, which is like Aries will command Pisces, Taurus will command Aquarius, or they would say also Taurus commands Pisces, Gemini commands Aquarius, Cancer commands Capricorn, etc. So two ways of doing it.
Yeah, another word that is used, Manilius calls it confronting, which
Mm-hmm.
I kind of like that a bit more than commanding.
Yeah,
I like that language a little bit more, just worth
yeah.
mentioning.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And I think especially like the crux of what this is all about is really in his first line of chapter 19, where he says the hearing and seeing signs are also useful in flights and dangers and
Hmm.
reports together with messages of the moon moving towards Mercury or the benefics. And then also like we were looking at Paul, who unlike the other authors that like Rhetorius is like compiling from, which is like Antiochus and Porphyry, Paul has like an identical chapter,
Yeah.
which I'll just read that little part that's very similar. He writes, yeah, the signs that obey each other correspond to a group of runaways and expatriates and of rumors along with reports, with the moon moving in her passage towards the star of Mercury or the benefic stars. So it's almost identical. But
Hmm.
the whole idea is that like apparently, oh, actually, I'll just read the sentence that he finishes that with, because that was what makes sense with this whole thing. So the moon moving towards the star of Mercury, the benefic stars, either in a nativity or in some horary or electional figure of those things being investigated in this regard. So somehow they use this technique in regards to like a horary or an inceptional or electional chart to figure out things about runaways and like slaves who may have ran away and trying to figure out where people are, people on the run or prisoners that escaped, or like a messenger that's like in traveler and transit and figuring out like where things land. Or I mean that's all they say, so we don't really have a lot to work off of beyond that, but somehow
Yeah.
this has some like higher level of interpretation that we're maybe not totally getting yet or reintegrating into the practice.
Well, in that, like, definitely, I feel like there is definitely still things to be uncovered, like, on this topic. But
Mm-hmm.
even in that article that Deborah Holding wrote, she provided this example from Manilius's text. And of course, I didn't read all of Manilius, like, between last week and this week. So take it
Yeah.
with a grain of salt. But she demonstrated an example from Manilius where Mars was at, I want to say, 17 degrees of Aquarius, and the moon was at 13 degrees of Cancer. And Manilius is saying that Mars is afflicting the moon by Antition, because Mars casts that partile trine, that partile degree, into the moon's reflected point by Anticia. And I
Mm.
thought that was really interesting because we're not just looking at we're not reflecting Mars, we're not reflecting the moon, and looking at how those reflections interact with each other. We're also looking at how those reflections interact with the rest of the natal chart and the natal placements without putting them through antiscia or contra-antiscia.
Yeah. I was just wondering, was that Manilius or Firmicus, this example?
Oh, I thought it was Manilius, but I could be mistaken.
It I haven't read that part of Manilius, so it might be, but I just know that Firmicus at least also then maybe has an example where um he's like talking about, yeah, this really interesting way that like, because we talked about antiscia at least in our videos and up until now is like, oh, it's going to reflect to another point, and if something's sitting there, then they can be connected if they're normally disjunct or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But this whole concept too gives us this idea that, say, like you said, Mars at 15 Aquarius is going to send an exact trine ray to 15 Gemini. And if the moon is at 15 Cancer, 15 Cancer and 15 Aquarius do not witness each other. There's no sympathy for Cancer and Aqua. Like that's one of those examples of another disjunct pair that he says has no sympathy.
Mm-hmm.
But because the moon will send her antition to 15 Gemini and that lands on the trine ray of Mars, like you're saying, yeah, like these antitions can like make an aspect to a thing and like kind of make the picture even more complex and nuanced.
Right. Yeah, you're right. It was Firmicus. I did get those crossed in my mind, but that was Firmicus's example. You're right.
Yeah, it's really interesting though. I mean, I don't use that a lot in practice ever,
But it's
but
definitely something that like I'm gonna start keeping an eye out for like much more clearly is how those reflected points interact with the natal chart. Because I mean, you don't read a 12th parts without like analyzing how they relate to the natal placements, you know?
yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely having like me reconceptualize this principle, you know, it's not just like a ray, right? Where when planets cast rays, it's not like you would have a sextile from the moon and a square from Mars meet at a specific degree and like that afflicts like the moon, right? Does that make sense? So like
Wait,
if
say it again.
so like Mars in Aquarius, moon in Cancer. It's
Hmm.
not that the moon at 15 degrees of Cancer sextile sends a sextile ray to 15 degrees Taurus. And then that degree where the sextile ray is being overcome by Mars in Aquarius, that's not really a thing. You don't look at aspects in that way, like where they meet, you know?
Right. There would have to be something like there to
There,
interact. Like if there was, if
exactly.
say they were like each 1 degree earlier and one later, and say it was like Mercury, or maybe put the moon in Taurus and like Mercury in Cancer, and like say the moon was like translating between those like that tiny interval of the aspects, like yeah, then but
Right.
like normally, I mean, yeah, they never would look at just where the aspect rays land, but an intuition
And
could right
uh-huh,
there.
yeah. And so there's a different attitude towards this
Mm,
method for sure than there
yeah,
is with just like regular aspects.
yeah.
So, yeah, definitely something I encourage everybody to play around with a bit.
Mhm. Yeah. The last thing I was just thinking about with this like commanding obeying thing too is like I know like in the Picatrix there's an example of like certain kinds of talismans that you can make that incorporate
Mm,
these commanding and obeying signs. If you're like trying to make an electional figure for a talisman where you need to like have an upper hand. I actually I didn't review the exact thing. I just remembered that like this was used in an astrological and magical context that like if you want like something to kind of have that power or make something run away or something. I mean, I don't even know, but it's like somehow that there's just more to this concept that like we kind of have to stretch our brains around playing with to see what else it's telling us.
yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
All
All right.
right. Do we want to move on to beholding?
Yeah.
I think it's
So
your turn. Yeah.
yeah, so 20, beholding. I'll also just say this chapter is very wordy, but it's saying something very simple.
Uh-huh.
And maybe there is more that we're not getting. And it's maybe could just be the Greek is really corrupt. And I think that has to be it because it just doesn't make sense. Like we've just read it over and over, and like it's saying some things, and we'll break it down our best. But here we go. Okay.
Bear with
Behold,
us.
yeah. Of these things being interpreted thus, beholding is said either when the one leading bears witness to the one following, or else aspects it by sextile or square or trine or opposition. I'm going to pause there because the problem is he initially doesn't define leading or following. And this is just like the star that is leading is in an earlier sign. So the idea there is that if you're looking on the wheel as the planets rise, like a planet in an earlier sign will rise kind of before the later one. So it's leading ahead of it, like in that morning or just daily motion. So the leading one's in an earlier sign, the following one is in a later one. And he says that leading one bearing witness to the following one, that's beholding. And he says you can do that by sextile, square, trine, or opposition. For moving along, it goes away into those that precede. For the planets move with the opposite motion to that of the signs. And that makes sense, right? They move in secondary motion, and primary motion is the motion of the signs, but the planets move, right?
Yeah.
Yet certainly they make for themselves the same course, and they revolve with it each day and night. So he's sort of just saying in the middle there that like there's this kind of connection between the way it goes into those that precede. That's the line. It's like it's kind of ambiguous what exactly he's saying.
So, I mean, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. Can we simmer on beholding and casting array like at the same time? Like I'll read casting array and then we can
Okay.
talk about this conceptual
Yeah.
element. Yeah. Because in casting array, he says some in chapter 21, casting array, he clarifies some of
Yeah.
that with an example. So he says, the one that follows is said to cast a ray to the one that leads according to the previously mentioned four aspects. For the ray of fire itself hastens to those that follow while sending forth a ray to those that lead. For example, the one in Aries beholds the one in Cancer, and the one in Cancer casts a ray to the one in Aries. And so, by the one leading and the one following, in the context of beholding, does seem to refer to diurnal motion.
Mhm.
And that's why he like incorporates that at the bottom. It's a little bit curious when he says, yet certainly they make for themselves the same course and they revolve with it each day and night. It sounds almost like he's like, yet certainly they make for themselves the same course. It almost seems like he's referencing retrograde motion here.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. But
Yeah.
that just like makes things so much more
Uh-huh.
confusing because like there is some doctrine about like aspects when planets are retrograde, and that's just like a whole other thing. But like he sort of says it like he's trying to say that, but doesn't define what that means or what it does. He's just saying that, yet certainly like they do make themselves the same course, or they do revolve with the primary motion, without saying that, yeah, that means that they're retrograde or what that actually means for interpreting these aspects. But that's what he's like alluding to without barely saying that.
Right.
So,
I mean, and like the only thing the only thing that I can think of that this might not be like that might not be about retrogradation is that he says like when he says for the planets move with the opposite motion to that of the signs, yet certainly they make for themselves the same course and they revolve with it each day and night. I
mm,
wonder if that might be kind of saying like, but certainly like they have the same course for themselves. Like they're still respectable. Like zodiacal movement still has this
mm,
element of authority, you know? It's not just diurnal movement that is
yeah.
like sure it's precedent, but it's not to overshadow zodiacal movement. Like
Mm,
certainly they move for themselves. That's
mm,
the only other thing that I can think of him
yeah.
doing that. And I feel like even then, like that's kind of like taking a large step,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, but essentially, beholding is being in a superior position, and casting a ray is being in the inferior position.
Mhm.
So, like,
Do you want me to share just the chart again to show?
yeah,
We won't actually pay attention to the fact that some of these configurations might not be possible, but the idea is just that, yeah, you want to keep going with that?
yeah. Just the idea that like Aquarius rises before Aries, before Taurus, before Gemini, therefore it's superior, and planets are in Aquarius before they are in the later signs. So they are beholding. So a planet in Aquarius beholds Aries, Taurus, and Gemini.
Mhm. Yeah. And then, so like Saturn and Air and Aquarius will behold Venus and Taurus, but Venus will cast a ray or hurl a ray back to Saturn in Aquarius.
Mm-hmm.
And the moon will behold Venus, and again, she'll cast a ray or hurl a ray back to the moon in Cancer. So just like this distinction between, this whole aspectual theory of like emitting visual rays when it's ahead of you, you're kind of looking right at it. But then when it's behind you, there's sort of like this like reflecting it back, like hurling a ray back at it, like a mirror or a reflection.
Right. Like if you're running a race, the race to the heavens, right? Um, and like you're in front of somebody, you have to turn your head back to like look at them. And that's
Yeah,
the kind of image that I get where it's like like throwing it back like that over the
right.
shoulder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we just read Dexter and Sinister real quick, and then we can just like
Yeah.
start talking about these
Mhm.
terms maybe more and show up the chart and kind of
Yeah.
bring things together. Okay.
Hmm.
All right, so this is our last chapter. So 22, Dexter and Sinister. Dexter aspects are those in the leading signs. So remember, in an earlier sign, and Sinister in the following. So, for example, the 30th degree of Cancer is rising, and it sends a Dexter sextile to the first degree of Gemini, and a Dexter square to the first degree of Taurus, and a Dexter trine to the first degree of Aries. And the whole hemisphere above the Earth is all Dexter, which is Latin for the word right. And then, but the Sinister, which is Latin for left, the Sinister sextile down to the 30th degree of Virgo below the Earth, square the 30th degree of Libra, trine the 30th degree of Scorpio, and all the hemisphere under the Earth. So Dexter aspects then are those which are in the leading signs as seen from whatever part of the zodiac, and Sinister in those that are following. And so like the idea here really in terms of why they call one left and one right is that if you're standing outside, like think back to last week when we pulled up Stellarium, if you're facing south and you're looking up at the midheaven, the highest point up in the sky, say that there's Cancer on the midheaven. As you look to your left, which is towards the east and what's rising, remember like the later signs are always following to the left, which is all Sinister. So the leading sign is earlier and the following sign is to the left. So any later sign is all Sinister because it's all to the left if you're standing outside. But the Dexter is always to the leading sign or to the earlier sign, which is would be looking out to the west, which is what's setting, which is like moving ahead. So,
Right. It's you're looking from the center out into the zodiac. You're not
mhm,
looking from the zodiac into the middle, if
mhm.
that makes sense.
Yeah,
So yeah, it makes more sense when you think about it like that. At least it did to me.
yeah.
Yeah. Also, I did want to say, I know we didn't really talk about this, but chapter 26 is really short and it's really relevant. Do you want to just like talk about it really quickly?
Um, yes.
Okay. So, well, plot twist,
Yeah.
dominance.
Okay.
Since it's relevant to today, little spoiler alert, our next episode is going to be on spear bearing and Dorofories.
Mhm.
So we're going to be talking about those. Because who doesn't want to talk about
You
those?
know, I want to.
I'm very excited for our next episode.
Yeah,
But
that'll be a really good one.
right. Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. But chapter 26 is kind of like Like it's the same topics that we're talking about today, sprinkled like in the middle of
Euphoria,
like
yeah.
Doraphories. Yeah. So chapter 26, page 21, dominance. Dominance and superiority is when a star is situated in the 10th house and makes a square to the left. Let Cancer be the ascendant, and those planets in Aries are superior to one in Cancer. Another kind of superiority is when someone being in a house on the right beholds one by a left trine or square or sextile.
Mhm.
So dominance and superiority, he kind of like mixes the two up, like not mixes the two up, but kind of blends them together with the first sentence, saying dominance and superiority are when a star is situated in the 10th house, makes a square to the left.
Mhm.
Um, when it's in a 10th house, like overcoming square, that is dominance. That is a dominating square, right? Superiority just refers to being earlier in aspect position,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Do
I
you want me to
I
share the chart?
sure.
And okay, you can keep going. I
Yeah.
just wanted to just ask if we
Mhm.
want to throw it up.
Yeah, no problem. Oh, yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah, lots of, and now we can kind of just throw all these terms at this and hopefully it will make a lot more sense.
yeah. So, a perfect example of dominance, um, and we'll get into like maltreatment a little bit more in a couple episodes, but that Mars is in a superior square, like decimating Venus in a way. Venus is applying and in the inferior position to that Mars in Cancer.
Hmm. Yeah, I think maybe just to simplify, we won't look applying or separating because I
Right.
know we'll talk about it, and I know just for myself that is what was so confusing about aspects is some are superior and some are inferior, but they could be applying or separating in either way. So I don't know. We'll get to that.
Gotcha.
But the basics is really just like, yeah, it's he's superior, he's higher up. That's the idea, is that when it's leading, it rises earlier, it's higher up, and so it has this like kind of upper hand in the aspect. So whatever is in the earlier sign, so Saturn is superior to Venus and Mars is superior to Venus, but Mars is doing this special thing because he's on the 10th sign, which is always the superior square. And that is called, yeah, 26 dominance or decimation. Um, and yeah, it's can be pretty harmful, especially if it's decimation from a malefic. And again, this doesn't have to be by degree. This can be by whole sign. In this case, yeah, if we look at degrees, it is very close. But essentially, Saturn is also, superior, but it's by a trine. But Mars is still
Right.
superior, but by square.
And
Um,
the like specific instance with like a planet being 10th from another, like when
mhm,
you think about the 10th house and all of these concepts of authority come out, they're written into the principle of being in the 10th place from another planet.
mhm,
So I feel like that's kind of being like carried forward into zodiacal interpretation, almost from like a derivative kind of understanding, you know?
yeah,
Yeah, so definitely a fascinating point.
yeah. And so again, with these same aspects, like Mars will behold Venus, who casts a ray to Mars, and Saturn will behold Venus, who casts a ray to Saturn, and Venus will behold Mercury, who casts a ray to Venus, and Venus will behold Jupiter, who casts a ray to Venus. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's see, what other like, well, maybe we can look at like the hearing and seeing really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So again, in the hearing and seeing, as he's defining it, we reflect from like 15 degrees of the cardinal signs. So from Cancer and Capricorn, Sagittarius and Aquarius are in a seeing and hearing relationship. And so the moon and Mercury have this extra sympathy. And yeah, that is the only one because Sun has no one to see or hear in Pisces, and Venus has no one in Aries from Libra. But then from the other commanding and obeying reflection, which is 15 Aries to 15 Libra, the Scorpio has no one in Virgo, Sag has no one in Leo, but Jupiter will obey Mars in Cancer, who commands Jupiter. And also Saturn in Gemini will command the moon in Aquarius, who obeys Saturn in Gemini.
And reflecting off of like the 0 degrees cardinal point, you can see that like that lot of fortune is actually like partile antition with Mars. Super, super close there. I mean, it's not partile, it's 2 degrees, but still pretty close there.
Mm.
There's another
Yeah,
one.
there are
Oh,
some cool Antiscia though. That one is very close. I think the Mercury Mars,
yeah.
this is now a contra-antiscia,
Mm-hmm.
is very close to the degree because 22, because Cancer and Sag, right, are contra-antiscia equal ascension, and we have like 6 and change plus 2 and change, which adds to like, that'll be around 28 and change, which is almost 29. So it's very close. And we can actually, yeah, AstroSeek
Yeah,
will display these very
there you
nicely.
go.
And you can see that the Mercury, it lands, so Mercury's contra-antition lands conjunct Mars. And you can see that Jupiter also sends a contra-antition from Capricorn into Gemini, which lands on the Saturn. And of course, then, they both will reflect each other. So Saturn's down here and also Mars is down here on the Mercury.
Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to see if there is. I think that the Jupiter Saturn is so fascinating too, but I'm trying
Oh
to
yeah, we
see if
haven't said whose chart this is yet.
yeah. This is Albert Camus.
Yeah.
Yeah, philosopher, author, just a really great mind.
Mhm.
He did a really, really good job of writing like really profound social meanings into like really creative works that weren't as conventional for the time, like literary works. I don't know. He was
Yeah. It was very
extraordinary.
thought-provoking. It was
Yeah,
very like
very,
original.
yeah, not definitely a sort of pioneer.
Yeah. Like La Peste is like, or The Plague is like one of the books that I read from him. And I remember like finishing the first half and it just ends at this very just abrupt cliffhanger. And it just, I don't know. I look at this like Mercury Mars contra antition, which again with like, a planet in detriment and a planet in fall, um, kind of links together like very sudden and shocking and like provocative, like mental, and like it is also a little bit violent and like a little bit horrifying in some ways. And at least this one book, and it is in more of his general sense of what he writes about. But yeah, there's a lot of like really shocking things that is like a very, for Mercury and Mars that don't see each other by a whole sign aspect, this contradiction is really loud. And also
Yeah.
we'll talk about how he did pass away, but like Mercury is his ascendant ruler. And it's being, his health and his body is really afflicted by a fallen Mars that's in a powerful house high up in the sky. And that definitely
And
contributes to, yeah.
um yeah. And like he wanted to be an athlete too. Like that
Mhm.
was something that he worked for in his younger
Yeah.
years. And like Mercury Mars connections, athlete. Like I know you're into competitive sports or something like that. Like it's
Yes.
almost always something like that.
That's a great point with it too.
Yeah. And however, with both of these planets lacking dignity,
Mhm.
it never came to fruition. He actually had like multiple fits of tuberculosis.
Mhm.
And we see that Saturn there, out of
Mhm.
sect, pretty angular,
Retrograde.
still cadent, like falling from the midheaven, but still quite angular. Yeah, retrograde in a double-bodied sign, out of
Actually, it
sect.
happened twice. He had like two major instances of like working towards his first time his like his sports career, and then got tuberculosis and had to quit, and then working towards like a thesis and like an honors program, and then like literally again it happened, and he had to like change direction in school and like pause his studies. And it's interesting too, like it is in with like the sign of the lot of fortune, which again is like not
Mhm.
great for your health to have the out of sect malefic, like with the fortune just showing bad circumstances relating to your health, and especially Gemini, of course, which is the lungs. So pretty, that makes a lot of sense. by degree, like you mentioned, they are cadent. And so I would read them also as in the ninth house. And it, he was a philosopher, right? He got grants to study at different like universities to study philosophy and write about ancient history and ancient philosophy. And yeah, this like Gemini Saturn in the house of like higher education and the house of God definitely makes a lot of sense as well, I think, too. Yeah, just what he was
Mhm.
inspired by.
Yeah, and with that Jupiter, like casting that antition there, like there's something, and I feel like there's almost an like Saturn kind of receives that in a way because
Mhm.
Jupiter is in
Exactly. Yeah.
Capricorn.
Hmm.
So, like, Saturn is able to use Jupiter in a very constructive way,
Hmm. Right.
especially because Jupiter is in Saturn's sign. And
Hmm.
so, that being in the ninth house with spirit, just having this drive, this will to like produce these literary works
Right. Yeah, of course, it is
just
all.
like and like despite illness,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was just going to say, of course, it is all in sign of, Mercury and Gemini. So it makes sense, of course, that he was, of course, known as a writer and a philosopher. And when we look at the Antiscia, um, yeah, these highlighted red lines you see now are the same thing as the other ones. It's just showing that so Saturn's Antician moves into Cancer, but it lands at the opposition of Jupiter, which
Hmm.
says the same exact thing as his direct contra-Antician would just land right there.
Right.
Because a planet's Antician and contra-Antician degree are always in opposition.
Hmm.
Um, and
Yeah, look at that lot of fortune right onto Mars.
yeah, I know that Mars fortune. I mean, one thing I actually found in this chart like a long time ago when I was researching it was like that it was around the time of that like direction when his fortune kind of progressed to that Mars that he did pass away. And so we can see that Mars is really afflicting his health because in this way as well, we know that the Antician will reflect it to fortune, which is not great. But also that's the opposition of Mercury because same thing with the Saturn Jupiter, the contra-Antician is also the opposite of the Antician. So we already know Mercury, Mars are contra, but here again, we see the Antician lands opposite. So just major afflictions to his health, and the timing was very pertinent to all of these configurations that are so evident through these reflections across the signs.
Definitely. Right. Because it's not every time that you
Mhm.
have fortune direct to a malefic that somebody dies, like it takes multiple different layers of
Mhm.
things, but those
Yeah,
layers are definitely here in his chart. And
yeah,
yeah, he was awesome, wonderful creative. I mean, look at the 12th part of that. I'm sorry, look at that Venus reflection, like into Pisces as well from Libra. Like,
right.
yeah, he was just so imaginative.
Right. And like even thinking about the fortune houses, like she squares the lot of fortune too from the 10th sign. So she
Mhm.
actually decimates, her Antician, right? So we're getting kind of specific
Right.
with it. But we were talking about, how they did layer these things. So in this way, her Antician moves into the 10th from fortune and she moves into exaltation. And he was, like you said, a creative, brilliant genius. So I think that ingenuity is really powerful from specifically because this Antician is almost within a degree an exact square to fortune,
Yeah.
which is really powerful by degree. And also like it's a nocturnal chart, so fortune is just more relevant in general. Um,
And
yeah.
and like the fortune reflects over to the 10th place from the natal Venus too. So like that
Yeah.
doubles down again. Like we
Yeah.
have Venus 10th from natal fortune and fortune 10th from natal
Yeah.
Venus.
That's cool how that works out.
Yeah, because
Um,
that doesn't always happen.
yeah, no, it doesn't. And one thing I was thinking of too, because we are layering this, I noticed it before, but I just didn't say it right away. But the sun here, so the sun is in Scorpio and Saturn's in Gemini, which again, an inconjunct pair that has no sympathies. This sun here at around 14, its anticision will be around 16, Leo, which is a close sextile to Saturn and Gemini. So now they can see and hear each other because the anticision does move into an aspect with the Saturn. So, that's going to connect the solar themes in his chart with the Saturnian themes, which is interesting because that will layer his like 12th house with his fifth house and his sixth house. And obviously he was suffered a lot in his health, mentally and physically. I mean, we can already see this like very peregrine moon, end of Aquarius is like not a great place for her. It's just a very Saturnian moon, essentially, which isn't great for her health, or his health,
Yeah.
or the moon's health, his health,
Right.
Luna's
Yeah.
light. And of course, just being cadent. And
Mhm.
there is a whole sign connection to Saturn, potentially a commanding seeing. But if you do even use that interpretation, then Saturn's commanding the moon who's obeying, right? And the
Mhm.
moon doesn't want to have to obey to the out of sect malefic that's just destroying her life force and who's already so weak, being so cadent. So,
Right. The sect
just
leader does not want to answer to the out of sect malefic.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, do you want to mention any dexter sinister? I mean, we've already said it in other language, but maybe just to say, like, imagine like you're outside, you look up, Saturn is going to be up to your right, and that Mars will
Right.
be a little over to the left. So, like, Saturn will send a dexter ray into Leo, and yeah, the intention of the sun maybe is there to receive that. But also, like, Mars more evidently will send um, a sinister. I'm sorry, did I say Dexter? I messed up.
Yeah.
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 It's funny. The language.
I
The idea is
know.
that it's,
Yeah.
later. So it's left. It'll rise later. So
Uh-huh.
sinister.
Yeah. So just to clarify, Saturn casts a sinister ray to Leo. Mars casts a sinister ray to Venus and Libra. But Venus is Dexter to Mars.
Mhm. Yeah. So she'll send the Dexter square. The sun will send the Dexter trine to Mars. Jupiter will send a Dexter square to Venus, and Venus will send a sinister square to Jupiter. Um, and the moon is sending a Dexter trine to the square to the sun, and the sun is sinister to the moon. So, yeah.
Right. And once again, like if you imagine it as you're standing on the outside looking in towards the center, like it's just like never gonna make sense. Like it's because it's backwards. Like
Yeah.
you're thinking like right
Right.
and
The ones
left.
below the hemisphere are you have to reframe it a little bit. The ones up here.
Uh-huh. But if you imagine that you're standing like in the middle of the cardinal
Yeah.
points
Right. And
and
you
you
look.
look, yeah, you're looking down, then you can much more clearly see like which one is on the
Yeah.
right and on the left. This
Yeah.
comes up a lot in like this language, Dexter and Sinister, comes
Mhm.
up like maybe not a lot, but quite a bit in ancient texts.
Mhm.
And I don't know, that was something that like definitely threw me off. Like I took Latin. Like I know a little Latin and I'm like, okay, right and left, but like what do you mean like right and left? Like this is on the left. Like it took me so long to like get that.
Yeah.
So
It's confusing, but
yeah.
it's just a term to describe that, yeah, you're higher up, you rose earlier. We get it. We got a little
Uh-huh.
upper hand there. All right.
Mhm.
Because we did talk about it, do you want to look at the Dodekatemoria and just highlight some
Yeah.
basic things? Because there are some freaking amazing things.
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna turn the wheel on around so that you can kind of just see those degrees as where they're sitting. So first of all, this is just his natal chart, and we have Egyptian bounds, and in these outer wheels, these are the 12th parts. So a place you can always start with in your chart is the 12th part of your ascendant, and you can see these little lines here show where that lands. So at 24 Virgo, the 12th part is Gemini, and that's powerful because from 22 and a half to 25 degrees of every sign is the 10th sign. And so it's powerful for planets in 22 and a half to 25 because they essentially decimate themselves, which isn't a bad thing. It's just that it brings itself to its like highest prominence. And so his ascendant being in this 12th part of the 10th sign is powerful. It actually is very eminent. And it's a sympathetic square because they're homozone, because it's going from Virgo to Gemini. And when we actually look by degree where that 12th part lands, it actually lands right on his midheaven. So it's a really
Mhm.
eminent configuration.
Yeah, and here we see again super, super clearly linking that Venus and that lot of fortune,
Hmm.
even though that would have quite a wide orb and there's other aspects that intervene. That
Mm,
Venus, the 12th part of Venus, is on fortune.
right.
So
Yeah.
that's just beautiful. Yeah.
Right. Because one thing that it's can be hard to understand sometimes is that like it lands within a spectrum of these 2.5 degrees. So it
Right.
is projected in equal proportion into the sign. So you can see her little green dot is a little bit, it's about 1/3 of the way through. It's not quite halfway yet. So she should be a little bit further back into Gemini. And then, yeah, when we go and look at that 12th part, she lands right at 10. And that, of
Right.
course, is right where the lot of fortune is. And fascinating with his chart, his Jupiter is not only in the exact contra-antiscia from Cap to Gemini, but his 12th part also lands there too, which is just absurd.
Yeah.
So you can see how Jupiter lands, of course, at 13.5 Gemini, which, like we mentioned, it's at 15 degrees that it will make an opposition into Cancer, or at 15 Sag into Gemini, or 15 Libra into Aries. So any planet at 12.5 to 15 are always in the sixth sign, which is normally not a great place because if you think of the sixth house, right, it's like there's generally, aspectual aversion. It relates to topics that like kind of reduce the life force and vitality of that thing and kind of deplete it and dilute it. So that's not the best. And Jupiter is moving into the sign of his detriment already from the sign of his fall. So if you incorporate dignity as well, it's kind of difficult. But he's landing on his ruler. Like he lands
Right.
on to Saturn and his contra-antiscia lands there. So
Right.
essentially what that means,
Jupiter,
oh yeah, you
I
go.
was gonna say Jupiter is struggling to do things for himself, but Saturn has Jupiter like right where Saturn wants him.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's great because like essentially that allows Jupiter to manifest what he's trying to do. When a
Right.
planet can witness its ruler, like the whole idea here is that normally this can't. Jupiter and Cap can't see Saturn Gemini. But by
Hmm.
contra-intuition and by magically his 12th part, which doesn't just happen like that all the time. Like this is a really cool configuration. Jupiter
Right.
is getting all the help he needs. And what does Jupiter rule in his chart? His Mercury. So whereas Mercury normally is not going to get like a lot of help, especially
Right.
because they're in an adjacent sign pair, there is slight aversion because these are signs that are anticia.
But
Capricorn and Sag do reflect. It's
there's a
not
pretty
precisely
wide orb.
right. It's wide orb,
Yeah.
but there's maybe some, sympathy, right?
Hmm.
The idea
Yeah.
was that these are injunct pairs that have a sympathy. So there is a sympathy. It's really powerful if it's to the degree, but it's mostly
Right.
that I'm just emphasizing that it's the ruler of his Mercury who's just getting like all this help when normally that should not be there. And yeah,
Uh-huh.
he was a writer. So
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah. And he was a a success. He was a successful writer,
mhm,
like despite a lot
mhm,
of the challenges. And like
yeah.
I feel like that's really represented by that retrograde out of sect malefic,
Mhm.
like soup pretty angular in the whole sign
Yeah,
10th.
whole sign it's angular.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And yeah, just super, super like powerful, creative mind, like
Mhm.
beyond, like despite all of his illnesses and the challenges that he was faced with.
Right. Another thing I like to look at too is the 12th part of the ascendant Lord. And so Virgo
Mhm.
rising Mercury, in detriment in Sagittarius is like, but his 12th part's into Aquarius, which is actually where Mercury does really well. He has
With the
triplicity.
moon.
Hmm. And so when we look at where he lands in Aquarius, it's actually a partile trine to his Venus. So Venus is 21 Libra, or she might be, yeah, she's 2051. But Mercury lands at, yeah. Oh my God. This chart.
Wow.
We keep finding the most insane
Wow.
things in this chart. What are the
Uh-huh.
odds that the 12th part
To
to
the
the minute
minute.
trines Venus? And
Uh-huh.
again, like eloquence of writing, just the beauty with which he
Hmm.
was able to convey his thoughts with words.
And
Um,
like Mercury's no longer like in opposition with Saturn with that
mhm.
like mutual
Right.
application.
There's some
Like,
reception now involved. It was
uh-huh.
his house. So it really
Yeah.
reduces in a lot of ways the maleficence you may see um, with Mercury, who's normally just having to what's called like push disposition or push rulership onto Saturn, who he owns. But now it's like, oh, okay, I won't just like, give you all of this. Like I'll, kind of take some from you too, in a way that ends up being pretty beneficial, because they're meeting by trine with a mutual
Right.
reception, at least from the 12th part of Mercury to
Mhm.
Saturn. And they're close by trine too, ish. It's like four,
Right.
four, 4 degrees or so.
Reception, I feel, makes that like much stronger, even though
Mhm.
there's a little bit of an orb.
Yeah.
I really like the sun
Yeah.
spirit,
I
like
wanted to talk
on
about
the
that too.
exaltation
Yeah.
degree. Yeah, we talked
Um,
about this a little last night, but
right.
I think that's so cool. Opposite Venus, sextile that Mercury, like that's a great little wedge there.
Right. In terms of just like spirit being our mind and our spiritual like illumination of, our consciousness and what we create, it's all about like what we kind of take over our environment from and like put into the world, with the sun, like on the sun's exaltation degree. Yeah, it's just really powerful to show that he's elucidating some pretty dark things. They're in his eighth house. So he wrote
Mm-hmm.
about and was inspired by and created material that was very profound and that was very, right, like one of his most famous books was called The Plague, which is just about
Right,
death. And
right.
yeah,
And like plague, I feel, is very, very like mutable malefics. There's
mhm,
something about the idea of like spread and like dissolution, especially because a lot of it's spread through water droplets, coughing, and like
mhm,
you see that like retrograde Saturn there, and also the 12th part of that Mars moves in to like its most dignified part of Pisces, pretty
yeah,
much, in its own decan, in its own bound. And
in a night
if you
chart,
want
it's got
to,
simplicity too.
yeah. And
Mm,
if you want to like really fractal, you
yeah,
see that it falls into what would
yeah,
be like the 12th squared part of Capricorn.
right. So you can look at, it's a lot, but
It's
it's a
yeah.
reinforcement though. His 12th part
Uh-huh.
lands in the 12th part of his exaltation. So it's like
Right.
there are these little things that contribute to that.
And it wasn't enough to keep him from having difficulties, like
Right.
that Mars is ultimately what killed him.
Mhm.
But like when you see ancients talking about like children who don't live past birth or infancy and stuff like that, like dying at a really young age, you can see that like even though he died when he was relatively young, he
Mhm.
still had like a very fruitful life before that happened. And
Right.
even though he struggled, like it wasn't like he had no ability to blossom into his
Yeah.
self.
Mhm. I think it is also relevant too that like the moon, obviously Aquarius isn't her favorite, but her 12th part at the end of Aqua does move into Capricorn. Like, so again, just more reduction to her life force that is showing up there. But
Mm-hmm.
also, I think, as we'll talk more about like, maybe even his personal life and his relationships, because that Mars, as a fallen malefic, becoming dignified, on the degree of the descendant in one way, will speak to the nature of his relationships, but also because Mars really is sort of an anaretic planet in this chart, even though he's insect, Mars and Saturn are both kind of have their own problems happening here.
Mm-hmm.
What I see here is too, like, he was in a car accident, but he was the passenger and his friend was driving him and drove off the road and killed him. And so it's kind of interesting how Mars is the lord of his eighth house, which makes him responsible for manifesting death,
Mm-hmm.
um, and is on the degree of the descendant, right? So, like the partner, and also all this fortune stuff that we were looking at that's like, fortune's opposite his ascendant ruler. And the ruler of fortune is in detriment, right? That's what that
And the
means.
ruler of the ascendant
Yes,
too.
right. And
Like,
like, yeah, I was just gonna say the mercurial piece, like he was with a friend,
mm,
it's like, and Mercury's placement by quadrant is in the third house. And he was driving, right? Automobiles, Gemini, right? So there's just like a lot of things here too with the Mars that I think particularly speaks to kind of the manner of his passing.
yeah, I agree. Mm-hmm.
Um, there's so much, and we can revisit it because there's still more things we could look at here in terms of, that Saturn descendant IC thing is a whole other story. But
Mm-hmm.
I think we should probably kind of wrap it up. And because we could keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, we could talk about his chart forever, and
Yeah.
we're going to
Yeah, we're gonna keep doing more
continue.
sessions where
Yeah.
we'll pull back these pieces on 12 parts or antiscia or incorporate a dexter, whatever. It's like overcoming, and we'll see how these things apply to further things that happen in his life and just really show how we can delineate a chart with these tools.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Super excited to continue Mercury. We forgot to
Oh,
mention our
I
birthday
know. It was our solar
again.
return. Well, no, we're doing it now, but last week it was
Right.
our solar return and we forgot to mention it.
I know.
But yeah, it's been 1 year, so that's exciting.
Yeah, a
We're
whole
now
year of Mercurianians.
we're now in a Cancer
Mhm.
perfection year, so that's exciting.
Yes.
And yeah, happy birthday, Marks.
Yep. Happy birthday, Mercs.
Mhm.
We'll continue Mercuraniing.
We'll continue, and we will see you guys next week with more on Dodekatemoria, which that'll be a big
Yes.
episode.
Stay tuned for that episode. That'll be a really
Mhm.
fun one.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, sweet. Well,
Alrighty.
we'll catch you later. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and Mercuranians out.
Mercuranian.